We are on to the epilogue, which isn't very long. When I came to England, I was as perfect a stranger to all the world as if I had never been known there. My benefactor and faithful steward, who had left in trust with my money, was alive, but had had great misfortunes in the world, was become a widow the second time, and very low in the world. I made her easy as to what she owed me, assuring her I would give her no trouble, but on the contrary, in gratitude to her former care and faithfulness to me, relieved her as my little stock would afford, which at that time would indeed allow me to do but little for her, but I assured her I would never forget her former kindness to me. I went down afterwards into Yorkshire, but my father was dead, and my mother and all the family extinct, except that I found 2 sisters and 2 of the children of one of my brothers, and as I had been long ago given over for dead, there had been no provision made for me, that means in the will. So that, in a word, I found nothing to relieve or assist me, and that little money I had would not do much for me as to settling in the world. I met with one piece of gratitude indeed, which I did not expect, and this was that the master of the ship, who I had so happily delivered, and by the same means saved the ship and cargo, having given a very handsome account to the owners of the manor how I had saved the lives of the men in the ship, they invited me to meet them and some other merchants concerned, and altogether made me a very handsome compliment upon the subject, and a present of almost £200 sterling. But after making several reflections upon the circumstances of my life, and how little way this would go towards settling me in the world, I resolved to go to Lisbon, and see if I might not come by some information of the state of my plantation in the Brazils, and of what was become of my partner, who I had reason to suppose had some years now given me over for dead. With this view, I took shipping for Lisbon, where I arrived in April following, my man Friday accompanying me very honestly in all these ramblings, and proving a most faithful servant upon all occasions. When I came to Lisbon, I found out by inquiry, and to my particular satisfaction, my old friend, the captain of the ship, who first took me up at sea off the shore of Africa. So yay, he's found someone alive. He was now grown old and had left off the ship, having put his son, who was far from a young man, into his ship, and who still used the Brazil trade. The old man did not know me, and indeed I hardly knew him, but I soon brought him to my remembrance, and as soon brought myself to his remembrance when I told him who I was. After some passionate expressions of the old acquaintance, I inquired, you may be sure, after my plantation and my partner. The old man told me he had not been in the Brazils for about 9 years, but that he could assure me that when he came away my partner was living, but the trustees who had joined with him to take cognizance of my part were both dead, that, however, he believed that I would have a very good account of the improvement of the plantation, for that upon the general belief of my being cast away and drowned, my trustees had given in the account of the produce of my part of the plantation to the procurator fiscal. Okay, so procurator fiscal is a Scottish position thing, which is interesting because Scotland hasn't really had a part in this so far. But, okay, yes, procurator fiscal. So in Scottish law, the procurator fiscal is an officer who is appointed by the court to act as the executor of an estate when someone has died or disappeared. I believe they also kind of function sometimes as a coroner, or did function sometimes as a coroner. My trustees had given in the account of the produce of my part of the plantation to the procurator fiscal, who had appropriated it in case I never came to claim it, 1/3 to the king and 2/3 to the monastery of St. Augustine, to be expended for the benefit of the poor and for the conversion of the Indians to the Catholic faith, but that if I appeared or anyone for me to claim the inheritance, it should be restored, only that the improvement or annual production being distributed to charitable uses could not be restored. But he assured me The steward of the king's revenue from lands and the steward of the monastery had taken great care all along that the incumbent, that is to say my partner, gave every year a faithful account of the produce, of which they received duly my portion. I remained in Lisbon to settle my affairs. Within 7 months I received what I was owed from the survivors of the trustees and the merchants, for whose account I had gone to sea. I was now master, all of a sudden, of above 5,000 pounds sterling in money, and had an estate, as I might well call it, in Brazils, of above 1,000 pounds a year, as sure as an estate of lands in England. And in a word, I was in a condition which I scarce knew how to understand, or how to compose myself for the enjoyment of it. So that's quite a lot of money. That makes him a wealthy man, relatively speaking. Yeah. My interest in the Brazils seemed to summon me thither, but now I could not tell how to think of going thither, till I had settled my affairs and left my effects in some hands behind me. At first I thought of my old friend the widow, who I knew was honest and would be just to me, but then she was in years, so she was old, but then she was in years, and but poor, and for aught I knew, might be in debt, so that in a word I had no way but to go back to England myself and take my effects with me. I arrived in London in January of the next year, and began to think of leaving my effects with the good widow and setting for Lisbon, and so to the Brazils. However, my true friend the widow earnestly dissuaded me from it, and so far prevailed with me that I sold my estate in the Brazils for 20,000 pounds, and for almost 7 years she prevented my running abroad, during which time I took my 2 nephews, the children of one of my brothers, into my care. The eldest, having something of his own, I bred up as a gentleman, and gave him a settlement of some addition to his estate after my decease. The other I put out to a captain of a ship, and after 5 years, finding him a sensible, bold, enterprising young fellow, I put him into a good ship and sent him to sea. Okay, so here's where you kind of get a little bit of insight into how class society was at the time. So because through his the middle class was growing in strength at this time, and this book and the whole idea of novels was something that shows the growing strength of the middle class. England used to be a society of basically the upper class, the people in religious orders, and then lower class. There wasn't really a middle class, but now there is a middle class, and it is growing, and it is strengthening, and it is, as Robinson Crusoe's father has said, one of the best estates to be in. And Robinson has made money being in the middle class, and he has improved his status so much so that he is wealthy enough now to essentially live the life of a gentleman. That means someone who doesn't really have to work much other than manage his business, and he is helping to raise his 2 nephews. And the way the world worked at the time was, if you were the children of someone who was wealthy, or if you were the natural inheritors of someone's wealth, then the oldest child would get everything. And any children after that had to work. So usually there were a few sort of limited careers that the subsequent children of a rich family could take part in. They could become lawyers. They could get a rank in the military. They could become part of the clergy, or they could join the Navy or become part of a ship, and they would kind of immediately go into being a captain or an officer of some higher rank, because they had the money and they can buy their way in, essentially. So they didn't really have the money, but I guess you could say their family had the money and they had the status and they could buy their way in. Yes, so he's made his eldest nephew a gentleman, and the eldest nephew gets everything, essentially, and the other he put to captain in a ship. And after 5 years, finding him a sensible, bold, enterprising young fellow, I put him into a good ship and sent him to the sea. And this young fellow afterwards drew me in, as old as I was, to farther adventures myself. So Robinson eventually gives up his sort of gentlemanly life and he goes off adventuring again. In the meantime, I in part settled myself here. For first of all, I married, and that not either to my disadvantage or dissatisfaction. I had 3 children, 2 sons and 1 daughter. But my wife dying and my nephew coming home with a good success from a voyage to Spain, my inclination to go abroad and his importunity prevailed and engaged me to go in his ship as a private trader to the East Indies. This was in the year 1694. Okay, so I just realized I misinterpreted what I'd read earlier. The oldest son would have already inherited his father's entire fortune, and Robinson is giving him a little bit more, but the oldest son would have gotten everything that his father left him, in all probability, because that's just the way it usually worked. In this voyage, I visited my new colony in the island, saw my successors, the Spaniards, had the whole story of their lives and of the villains I left there, how at first they insulted the poor Spaniards, how they afterwards disagreed, united, separated, and how at last the Spaniards were obliged to use violence with them, how they were subjected to the Spaniards, how honestly the Spaniards used them, a history, if it were entered into, as full of variety and wonderful accidents as my own part, particularly also as to their battles with the Caribbeans, who landed several times upon the island, and as to the improvement they made upon the island itself, and how 5 of them made an attempt upon the mainland, and brought away 11 men and 5 women prisoners, by which, at my coming, I found about 20 young children on the island. So it's very populated now. Here I stayed about 20 days, left them supplies of all necessary things, and particularly of arms, powder, shot, clothes, tools, and 2 workmen, which I brought from England with me, a carpenter and a smith. Besides this, I shared the island into parts with them, reserved to myself the property of the whole, but gave them such parts respectively as they agreed on, and having settled all things with them and engaged them not to leave the place, I left them there. So he has essentially colonized the island now. From thence I touched at the Brazils, from whence I sent a bark, which I brought there with more people to the island, and in it, besides other supplies, I sent 7 women, being such as I found proper for service, or for wives to such as would take them. As to the Englishmen, I promised them to send them some women from England, with a good cargo of necessaries, if they would apply themselves to planting, which I afterwards performed, and the fellows proved very honest and diligent after they were mastered and had their property set apart for them. I sent them also from the Brazils 5 cows, 3 of them being big with calf, some sheep, some hogs, which when I came again were considerably increased. But all these things, which an account of how 300 Caribbees came and invited them, and ruined their plantations, and how they fought with that whole number twice, were at first defeated, and 3 of them killed. But at last a storm destroying their enemies' canoes, they famished or destroyed almost all the rest, and renewed and recovered the possession of their plantation, and still lived upon the island. All these things, with some very surprising incidents and some new adventures of my own, for 10 years more, I may perhaps give a farther account hereafter. In other words, prepare for the sequel. And there was one, because it was a popular book.